The yellow dress caught Gideon Falcone's attention first. A splash of sunshine weaving desperately through lunch-hour pedestrians on Madison Avenue, while a child's voice cut through traffic noise with the kind of terror that makes strangers look up from their phones. She couldn't have been older than 7, dark hair flying loose from braids, running straight toward him with purpose that suggested this wasn't random panic. Gideon's security detail moved immediately into defensive formation, hands disappearing inside jackets toward weapons that had ended problems more efficiently than conversation ever could. Marcus Webb stepped forward to intercept the running child with the blank expression of a man paid to eliminate threats regardless of their size. But something in the girl's face made Gideon raise one hand in a gesture that froze his entire team mid-motion. "Check the trunk!" The words exploded from her mouth and a voice scraped raw from screaming, her small hand grabbing Gideon's jacket sleeve with fingers that left dusty prints on Italian wool. She yanked at him with surprising strength, trying to physically pull a man twice her size away from the black sedan idling at the curb. "Please, you have to check right now, I saw them." The downtown intersection held perhaps 200 people at that moment, business professionals grabbing coffee before afternoon meetings, tourists consulting phones for directions. Not one of them had noticed 2 men in maintenance coveralls spending 7 minutes underneath a luxury vehicle, working with focused intensity that suggested professional expertise. But this child had noticed from her spot on the library steps across the street. She'd been sitting with her backpack and sketch pad, drawing architectural details of the building's Art Deco facade, while her mother finished a shift that started before dawn. Her gray-green eyes had tracked movement that everyone else dismissed as routine city maintenance, her artist's attention catching details that blended into urban background noise. 7 years old, and she understood that something wrong was happening even if she couldn't name exactly what it was. Marcus already had his phone out, barking orders to the bomb squad with clipped efficiency born from deployments where hesitation measured the difference between walking away and being carried. The driver backed away from the sedan with hands raised, his face draining of color because he'd performed his security check that morning. Gideon looked down at the girl still clutching his sleeve, her yellow dress stained with city grime, and her sneakers worn through at the toes. The bomb squad arrived in 4 minutes, that felt like hours compressed into seconds, their approach clearing the intersection with efficiency that came from understanding how crowds and explosives created casualty counts. The senior technician crawled under the sedan with equipment detecting chemical signatures invisible to human senses, her movements deliberate despite the tension crackling through assembled security personnel. Patricia Chen had diffused devices in 14 countries and recognized sophisticated work when she saw it. When she emerged, her face held the particular expression of someone who'd just seen craftsmanship that elevated murder into art form. She signaled for the portable containment unit with hand gestures that communicated urgency without panic. Professional calm, masking genuine alarm. "Military-grade devices with remote detonation capability," she said quietly, her voice pitched only for Gideon's ears. "Professionally installed, probably activated already and waiting for signal." The child hadn't moved from Gideon's side, her small hand still gripping his jacket like a lifeline, while chaos organized itself around them. Her breathing had slowed from panicked gasps to something approaching normal, but her eyes tracked every movement the bomb squad made with unusual intensity. She wasn't crying or seeking comfort the way traumatized children typically did. She was watching to make sure the adults actually fixed the problem she'd identified. Marcus established a 3-block perimeter while Patricia's team worked with robotic precision to disable devices that could have eliminated everyone within 50 yards of the detonation point. The technology involved suggested resources beyond typical rival organization capabilities, military-grade hardware that required connections most criminal enterprises couldn't access. Gideon's mind was already running through the short list of enemies, with both motivation and means to orchestrate this level of sophistication. The girl finally released his jacket when the lead technician gave the all-clear signal, stepping back with visible reluctance as though maintaining physical contact kept danger at bay. Her backpack hung crooked on thin shoulders, one strap threatening to slide off entirely, and Gideon noticed the careful mending on the yellow dress. "How did you know?" he asked, crouching down to her eye level in a movement that made his security team tense. "How did you see what no one else saw?" She pulled a sketch pad from her backpack, flipping it open to reveal a drawing of the street scene rendered with surprising detail for someone her age. 2 figures in coveralls were depicted under the sedan, their body positions suggesting work rather than casual inspection, tools visible in hands that she'd drawn with careful attention. "I was drawing the building," she explained, her voice still carrying tremors from adrenaline crash. but they kept moving and I had to add them to make the picture right. The sketch showed timestamp notations in a child's careful printing, marking when the men arrived and departed with the kind of detail that suggested she understood documentation mattered. Her artist's eye had captured the vehicle's license plate number in the corner of the composition, incorporated into the drawing's overall design. Gideon realized he was looking at evidence gathered by someone who documented the world without understanding. She was creating testimony that might save lives. Marcus leaned over Gideon's shoulder to examine the sketch, his expression shifting from professional assessment to something approaching wonder at the level of detail a 7-year-old had captured. The license plate alone would lead them to whoever provided the vehicle, and the physical description she'd rendered would help identify the bombers. "You did something very brave today," Marcus told her, his voice gentler than Gideon had ever heard. "You saved a lot of people." The girl's chin lifted with pride that battled against the exhaustion making her shoulders slump. Gray-green eyes meeting Gideon's, with directness unusual in children. "My mom says paying attention keeps you safe," she offered, the statement carrying weight of someone who'd learned threat assessment as survival skill. "She says if you watch carefully, you can see when something's wrong before it hurts you." The words suggested a childhood where danger wasn't abstract concept, but daily navigation requirement. Police units arrived to secure the scene and collect evidence, their presence transforming the intersection into controlled chaos of flashing lights and radio chatter. Detective Sarah Reeves approached with notepad already out, an expression suggesting she recognized Gideon despite never having met him officially. Her eyes moved from the bomb squad's equipment to the small girl standing beside a man whose photograph appeared in files marked with red flags. "We'll need a statement," Reeves said, addressing the child directly rather than speaking over her head to the adults who'd gathered protectively. "Can you tell me your name and how you came to be here today?" The girl's hand found Gideon's jacket sleeve again, a gesture seeking security rather than permission. He felt something unexpected shift in his chest at the trust implicit in that small touch, from someone who had every reason to fear men like him. "Maisie," the girl answered, her voice steadying now that immediate crisis had passed, and adults were handling cleanup with competent efficiency. "Maisie Brennan. I was waiting for my mom to finish her shift at the coffee shop." She pointed toward a small cafe 3 blocks down, the kind of place that paid minimum wage and expected maximum effort. Her matter-of-fact tone suggested this waiting arrangement was routine rather than exceptional circumstance in her daily life. The police precinct's waiting area smelled like industrial cleaner fighting a losing battle against decades of human desperation, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that made everyone look guilty. Cassidy Brennan burst through the doors with the kind of speed that came from receiving a call saying her daughter was at police headquarters. Her garçonette uniform still carried the coffee shop's signature scent of espresso and anxiety, her gray-green eyes scanning the room before locating Maisie sitting beside a man in an expensive suit. "Maisie," the name came out as prayer and accusation simultaneously, maternal relief wrapped around fear that her 7-year-old had somehow crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. She crossed the waiting area in seconds, dropping to her knees in front of her daughter with the kind of physical need to confirm safety. Her hands shook as they checked for injuries her rational mind knew couldn't exist given Maisie's calm demeanor. Maisie launched into explanation with breathless enthusiasm of children recounting adventures they don't fully understand the danger of, describing men and tools, and her decision to run across traffic. Cassidy's face transitioned through expressions that Gideon read easily, maternal pride in her daughter's courage battling horror at the risks taken. Her hands remained on Maisie's shoulders throughout the story, anchoring points that reminded the child she was safe now. Detective Reeves emerged from an interview room with file folders that suggested she'd spent the last hour pulling records and making calls that connected dots and patterns. "Ms. Brennan, I need to ask you some questions about your daughter's whereabouts today, and her relationship to Mr. Falcone here." The detective's tone remained professionally neutral, but Cassidy's spine stiffened with defensive posture of someone who'd spent years having her parenting questioned by authorities who measured worth by zip codes. "There is no relationship," Cassidy said flatly, her accent carrying particular rhythms of someone who'd grown up in neighborhoods where police presence meant trouble rather than protection. "Maisie was waiting for my shift to end like she does every Thursday." The statement held both explanation and challenge, daring anyone to criticize arrangements that kept her child safe, while she earned wages that barely covered their weekly motel room. Gideon had remained silent during the reunion, observing dynamics that spoke volumes about this small family's circumstances without requiring detailed explanation. The worn quality of their clothing, the way Cassidy moved with efficiency suggesting she couldn't afford wasted motion, The fact that a 7-year-old waited alone at a library instead of attending after-school programs. Everything painted picture of survival rather than living. Choices made from necessity rather than preference. "Your daughter saved my life today," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the detective's questions with authority that came from decades of people stopping when he spoke. "She has extraordinary observational skills and the courage to act on what she sees." The statement was simple fact rather than flattery. Recognition of abilities that had prevented his death, and possibly the deaths of others in the detonation radius. Cassidy's eyes met his for the first time, and Gideon saw intelligence there that circumstance had never given opportunity to fully develop, potential crushed under weight of whatever choices or misfortunes had led here. "She's good at noticing things," Cassidy acknowledged, the statement carrying both pride and wariness of stranger-praising child, in ways that sometimes preceded demands. "I teach her to pay attention because the world isn't safe for people who don't watch carefully." Detective Reeves cleared her throat, redirecting attention back to procedural requirements that came with attempted murder investigations involving organized crime figures. "Mr. Falcone, we've identified the vehicle used by the bombers as registered to a shell company with connections to the Marchetti organization. Given your history with Sergio Marchetti, we're treating this as escalation of ongoing territorial dispute." She didn't bother pretending ignorance of Gideon's actual business interests. Her tone suggesting years investigating organized crime had eliminated need for polite fictions. The name Marchetti made Gideon's expression harden in ways that caused Cassidy to instinctively shift her body between him and her daughter, maternal protection against danger she didn't fully understand. Sergio Marchetti ran waterfront operations with the kind of brutality that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable, his approach favoring spectacle over efficiency in ways that created unnecessary collateral damage. The bombing attempt bore his signature preference for dramatic gestures, but the sophisticated technology suggested he'd formed alliances that elevated his capabilities beyond typical street-level execution. Marcus Webb appeared in the precinct doorway, with 2 additional security personnel, his presence communicating that whatever grace period the police station provided was ending. "We need to move," he said to Gideon, his eyes scanning the waiting area with assessment that cataloged exit routes and potential threats. "Marchetti knows his people failed, and he'll be looking to finish what they started or eliminate anyone who can identify his operatives." Cassidy stood immediately, pulling Maisie close with protective instinct that anticipated being told to leave so important men could handle important business without witnesses who complicated matters. "We should go," she said to her daughter, already moving toward the exit with efficient departure of people accustomed to being dismissed from spaces they'd never been welcome. But Gideon's next words stopped her mid-step, the kind of statement that changed trajectories in ways that couldn't be predicted until looking backward from future vantage points. "You can't go home." The statement emerged as fact rather than suggestion, delivered with certainty that came from understanding how men like Marchetti operated when seeking revenge. "If he knows who stopped his operation, he'll come after your daughter to eliminate the witness and send a message." The words were blunt but necessary, stripping away any comfortable illusions about returning to normal life after interfering with organized crime operations. Cassidy's face went pale as the implications registered, her hand tightening on Maisie's shoulder with grip that made the child wince slightly. "We don't have anywhere else to go," she said quietly, the admission clearly costing her pride that had been built on foundation of never asking for help. "The motel we're staying at is week to week, and I can't afford to lose my job by disappearing without notice." Marcus pulled up something on his phone, his expression darkening as he showed the screen to Gideon with gesture that communicated urgency. Surveillance footage from the motel showed 2 men in leather jackets asking questions at the front desk, their body language aggressive enough that the clerk looked frightened. "They're already looking," Marcus said grimly. Standard intimidation pattern, asking about residents matching Maisie's description, probably showing her sketch from the news coverage that's already hitting social media. The reality of the situation settled over Cassidy's features with weight that aged her by years and seconds, maternal fear overriding any other considerations. "What do you want from us?" she asked Gideon directly, her voice carrying exhaustion that suggested she'd learned nothing, came free in a world that extracted payment for everything. "Why would you help? Men like you don't do anything without expecting something in return." Gideon understood her suspicion, recognized it as survival instinct honed by experience that taught her to question motives of people offering assistance. "Your daughter saved my life when she had no obligation to do so," he said simply, meeting her eyes with directness that communicated sincerity without pleading. "I'm offering protection because it's the right thing to do." And because Sergio Marchetti made this personal the moment he put explosives under my car. Keeping you safe isn't charity. It's strategic necessity. Detective Reeves interjected before Cassidy could respond, her professional assessment overriding whatever personal opinions she held about Gideon's business operations. Mr. Falcone's right about the threat level. Marchetti won't stop with failed attempt, and witness elimination is standard procedure for his organization. She paused, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to suggest. Our department can offer protective custody, but resources are limited and the process takes time you don't have. His security would be more immediate. Cassidy's jaw tightened with the particular tension of someone being forced to choose between bad options, with no good alternatives in sight, her pride warring with maternal instinct that prioritized Maisie's safety above personal preferences. For how long? She asked finally, the question directed at Gideon with assessment that suggested she was calculating costs beyond the obvious. How long would we need to stay under your protection before it's safe to return to normal life? Gideon exchanged glances with Marcus, both men understanding that the honest answer wasn't one a mother would want to hear, but deserved anyway. Until Marchetti's neutralized or convinced that pursuing revenge costs more than it's worth, Marcus said with military directness that didn't soften uncomfortable truths. Given his personality profile and organizational structure, that could take weeks or months depending on how quickly we can identify his co-conspirators and dismantle the network that provided the explosives. The time frame made Cassidy's shoulders slump with defeat that came from recognizing her daughter's safety, required sacrifices she hadn't anticipated making when her shift started that morning. I'll lose my job, she said quietly, the statement carrying weight of understanding that employment in service industry didn't accommodate extended absences. The apartment too, even though it's just a motel room. Everything we own is there, which isn't much, but it's ours. Maisie had been quiet throughout the adult conversation, her gray-green eyes tracking speakers with attention that suggested she understood more than her age should allow. Mom, she said softly, her small hand finding her mother's with touch that offered comfort rather than seeking it. The man said I saved people. That means the bad people want to hurt me for doing the right thing. The childish logic was sound enough to make Cassidy's eyes shine with unshed tears. Gideon crouched down to Maisie's level again, maintaining eye contact that treated her as person capable of understanding, rather than child requiring protection from reality. Your mother's worried because accepting help from someone like me comes with complications, he explained carefully, choosing words that conveyed truth without overwhelming. But I promise that keeping you safe is the only thing I want in return for your courage today. No other obligations, no hidden expectations. Cassidy studied him with intensity that suggested she was attempting to read truth in expressions that 20 years of criminal enterprise had taught him to control perfectly. Why? She demanded, the single word carrying volumes of skepticism earned through experiences that taught her motives were rarely as simple as stated. You're a crime boss. Everyone in this precinct knows it even if they can't prove enough to prosecute. What's the real reason you care about protecting a waitress and her kid? The directness surprised Gideon in its unvarnished honesty. Most people either feared him too much or wanted something from him too badly to speak without calculation. Your daughter's father, he said quietly, watching Cassidy's face carefully for reaction that would tell him whether he'd guessed correctly about the source of their circumstances. His name was Connor Brennan, and he saved my life during a military operation 15 years ago in a way that cost him everything. Cassidy's face went completely still, the kind of frozen shock that came from having past collide with present, in ways that rearranged understanding of both. You knew Connor? The question emerged barely above whisper, her hand finding the edge of a chair for support, as though her legs couldn't be trusted to hold her upright. You were there when he died. The pain in her voice carried 15 years of grief that had never fully healed. I was there, Gideon confirmed, his own voice carrying weight of survivor's guilt that decades hadn't diminished despite his best efforts. Connor Brennan pulled me out of an ambush in Kandahar when my unit was pinned down by insurgent fire. He took rounds meant for me, bought me enough time to reach cover. The memory was clear, despite years of trying to bury it under layers of criminal enterprise that distanced him from the soldier he'd been. They told me it was classified operation, that I couldn't know details because of national security concerns, Cassidy said, her voice strengthening with anger that had been building for 15 years without proper target. They gave me a flag and a pension that barely covered funeral costs, told me Connor died a hero but couldn't explain how or why. Then the pension stopped after 3 years because of some administrative technicality no one would explain clearly. The pieces fell into place for Gideon with sickening clarity. Bureaucratic failures compounding tragedy in ways that transformed military widow into struggling garçonette raising daughter alone. The operation went wrong, he explained, guilt making the words difficult even after all this time. Our intelligence was compromised, and the ambush was designed to eliminate everyone involved. Connor's actions weren't just heroic, they prevented total mission failure and saved 6 lives, including mine. But command buried the details because acknowledging what happened meant admitting catastrophic security breach. Maisie had been listening with the intense focus of child-learning father she'd never known was real person rather than abstract concept. "My dad saved you?" she asked Gideon, her voice carrying wonder mixed with pride that transformed shame she'd apparently carried about unknown father. "My mom said he was brave, but everyone at school says their dads are important, and mine just disappeared before I was born. But he was actually a hero?" "He was," Gideon confirmed with absolute certainty, seeing in Maisie's face the same stubborn courage that had characterized Connor Brennan's actions under fire. "Your father gave his life to protect people he'd never met, made the hardest choice a soldier can make. Everything I've accomplished since that day exists because Connor decided my life was worth saving, even though it cost him his own future with you and your mother." The revelation shifted something fundamental in Cassidy's expression. Suspicion giving way to grudging acceptance that maybe Gideon's offer came from genuine debt, rather than calculated manipulation. "So you're protecting us because you owe Connor," she said slowly, processing implications that transformed simple protection arrangement into something more complex. "You've lived 15 years with survivor's guilt, and now his daughter saves your life through the same kind of courage he showed. That's not coincidence you can ignore." Detective Reeves had been silent during the emotional exchange, but now she cleared her throat with professional redirection that acknowledged personal history while remembering they remained in police precinct. "Mr. Falcone's estate has security infrastructure that makes it arguably safer than protective custody given Marchetti's connections within law enforcement," she admitted with obvious reluctance to endorse criminals' protection over department resources. "If you're going to accept his offer, we should move you before more news coverage makes Maisie's face recognizable to anyone Marchetti has watching public locations." Marcus was already coordinating logistics on his phone, arranging convoy routes that avoided predictable patterns and calling ahead to estate security to prepare accommodations. "We'll stop by the motel to collect your belongings," he told Cassidy with efficiency that anticipated arguments about leaving possessions behind. "Quick extraction, in and out in under 5 minutes to minimize exposure. Anything you can't grab immediately, we'll replace." Cassidy looked at Maisie, seeking confirmation in her daughter's face for decision that would change their lives in ways neither could fully predict. "What do you think, baby?" she asked softly, giving 7-year-old agency and choice that affected her most directly. "Do you trust him to keep us safe?" The question acknowledged Maisie's observational skills that had proven more reliable than adult assumptions. Maisie studied Gideon with the same intense focus she'd applied to drawing street scenes, her artist's eye attempting to capture truth in expressions and body language. "He's scared too," she said finally, the observation delivered with childish directness that adults learn to camouflage. "Not of the bad people, but of not being good enough to protect us like my dad protected him. That means he'll try really hard not to fail." The insight was uncomfortably accurate, piercing through Gideon's carefully maintained composure with precision that reminded him why he'd survived 20 years in business that killed most within 5. "Your daughter's right," he acknowledged to Cassidy, allowing vulnerability he typically reserved for no one. "I failed Connor by not recognizing the ambush signs quickly enough. I won't make the same mistake with his family. Whatever it takes to keep you safe, I'll do it." The motel room smelled like industrial disinfectant and water damage, a single space with kitchenette that had housed Cassidy and Maisie for 8 months after the last apartment became unaffordable. Marcus's security team entered first, clearing the space with professional efficiency, while Cassidy stood in the doorway with embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Everything they owned fit into 3 duffel bags and a cardboard box, possessions that spoke of careful prioritization between necessity and sentimentality, in a life where storage fees represented impossible luxury. Maisie moved immediately to the corner where her art supplies lived in a plastic bin, carefully packing sketch pads and colored pencils with the reverence of someone who understood these tools represented her primary means of processing the world. Cassidy grabbed clothing from the single dresser with practiced speed, folding with efficiency that wasted no motion. The room held no photographs on the walls, no decorations beyond a single drawing Maisie had made of flowers that was taped beside the small bed they shared. 2 minutes, Marcus announced, his eyes on the parking lot where anyone could appear with intentions that ranged from curiosity to violence. His hand rested near his weapon with casual readiness that suggested drawing it would require no conscious thought. The team member stationed outside radioed confirmation that 3 vehicles were approaching from the north entrance, their speed and formation suggesting either law enforcement or organized surveillance, rather than ordinary motel guests returning from errands. Gideon moved to the window, positioning himself where he could observe without presenting silhouette target that invited sniper fire from rooftops across the street. 2 of the vehicles were unmarked sedans that screamed federal surveillance, but the third was black SUV with tinted windows that matched Marchetti's preferred transportation. "We're leaving now," he said quietly, his tone communicating urgency without panic that would frighten Maisie. "Leave whatever isn't packed. Marcus will carry what we have." Cassidy grabbed the flower drawing from the wall, folding it carefully before tucking it into her jacket pocket, with gesture that suggested this single piece of paper held more value than anything else in the room. "That's everything that matters," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear Gideon could read in the tension of her shoulders. Maisie clutched her art supplies against her chest with both arms, ready to move on command from adults who'd suddenly become responsible for navigating danger she'd inadvertently created. The convoy extraction happened with military precision, Marcus's team forming protective box around Cassidy and Maisie as they moved from room to vehicles that idled with doors already open. Gideon took point position despite Marcus's objection, his presence communicating to any observers that these people under his protection carried his personal guarantee of safety. The black SUV that had been approaching accelerated suddenly, closing distance in a way that eliminated any pretense of coincidental presence in the motel's parking lot. "Go," Marcus snapped to his driver, and the convoy pulled out with coordinated timing that put 2 vehicles between Gideon's car and the pursuing SUV. The federal sedans followed at a distance that suggested they were documenting rather than intervening. Observers to territorial dispute, they had no authority to prevent. Cassidy wrapped her arm around Maisie in the back seat, her body instinctively positioning itself between her daughter and the rear window where threats might materialize. The chase lasted 7 minutes through residential streets where speed limits became suggestions ignored by all parties, until Marcus coordinated with local police to establish roadblock that separated pursuit from prey with authority of law enforcement that even Marchetti's people wouldn't challenge directly. The SUV peeled off at the intersection, disappearing into traffic with the ease of drivers who knew when tactical retreat preserved future opportunities better than confrontation, that attracted unwanted official attention. Gideon watched the city pass outside his window as they headed toward a state on the outskirts, massive properties that old money had claimed generations ago, and new money defended with modern security infrastructure. "Are you hurt?" he asked Maisie, keeping his voice gentle despite the adrenaline still flooding his system from the extraction's danger. The girl shook her head, her gray-green eyes reflecting excitement more than fear, in a way that suggested resilience beyond her years. "That was like a movie," Maisie said with childish wonder, that found adventure in circumstances that terrified her mother. The cars were going really fast and everyone knew exactly what to do without even talking much. Her artist's mind was already processing the experience as narrative rather than trauma, compartmentalizing fear in a way that would probably require therapy eventually, but served protective purpose in the immediate moment. Cassidy's expression held the particular desperation of a parent recognizing that choices made to ensure safety might create different damage than the threats they escaped. "This isn't normal, baby," she told Maisie firmly, her tone carrying weight of needing her daughter to understand danger rather than romanticize it. "This is what happens when bad people don't want others to stop them from doing bad things. It's serious and scary, not exciting." The estate gates appeared like threshold between worlds, iron forged into patterns that suggested both elegance and fortification, the kind of entrance that communicated wealth interested in privacy more than display. Security personnel operated the gate from guardhouse that contained surveillance equipment, monitoring approaches from multiple angles, their professional bearing suggesting former military or law enforcement backgrounds. The grounds beyond stretched across acreage that would have housed 50 families in the city, rolling lawns and mature trees creating landscape that seemed impossible so close to urban density. Maisie pressed her face to the window with the unguarded wonder of childhood that found magic in spaces designed to impress, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to take in everything at once. "Is this where you live?" she asked Gideon, with disbelief coloring her voice, unable to reconcile the man in the expensive suit with property that resembled settings from fairy tales. "It's like a castle, but without the tower parts." The main house rose 3 stories in architectural style that combined classical columns with modern glass, traditional wealth updated with contemporary security features, integrated so smoothly they seemed like design choices rather than defensive measures. Staff appeared on the front steps with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to unexpected guests, requiring immediate accommodation, their faces professionally neutral in the way of employees who ask no questions about their employer's business decisions. Cassidy climbed out of the vehicle with visible reluctance, her body language communicating she was crossing boundaries she couldn't uncross, entering world that operated by rules she didn't understand. "How long have you lived here?" she asked Gideon, the question carrying subtext about the distance between their circumstances that went beyond mere financial disparity. This wasn't just wealth, it was generational power, made physical in architecture and land. "The estate belonged to my grandfather," Gideon explained as they walked toward the entrance, his tone suggesting complicated relationship with inheritance that came with obligations beyond simple ownership. He built legitimate business empire importing textiles, though the methods he used to establish market dominance weren't always legal. I inherited the property and the organization he created, along with the enemies he made and the expectations that came with the family name. The admission surprised Cassidy with its honesty about origins that most men in Gideon's position would sanitize into respectable history, acknowledging criminal foundation without attempting to justify it. "So you're saying you didn't choose this life, you inherited it," she said slowly, processing implications that complicated her moral assessment. "That doesn't make what you do acceptable, but it makes it different than someone who pursued power deliberately." "I made choices along the way," Gideon countered, unwilling to claim complete innocence when his actions over 2 decades had expanded rather than dismantled the empire he'd inherited. "I could have walked away, sold the properties, invested in legitimate enterprises, but I told myself I could reform from within, make the organization less brutal while maintaining enough strength to protect what my family built. Whether that's true or just rationalization is something I examine most nights without reaching comfortable conclusions." The interior entry hall featured artwork that belonged in museums, paintings and sculptures that represented investments worth more than most people earned in lifetimes, beauty preserved by wealth that insulated it from the ordinary world's decay. Cassidy's expression reflected discomfort with surroundings that made her own poverty feel more acute by contrast, her hand finding Maisie's with grip that communicated they needed to stay anchored to each other in this alien environment. A woman in her 50s approached with the confident bearing of someone who managed household operations with absolute authority, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in practical style that suggested efficiency over vanity. "Mr. Falcone," she said with warmth that indicated long employment relationship beyond simple professional courtesy, "I've prepared the East Wing guest suite as you requested. 2 bedrooms with connecting sitting room and private bathroom, 2nd floor overlooking the gardens." "Thank you, Margaret," Gideon replied, then turned to Cassidy and Maisie with gesture that invited them to follow the housekeeper. "Margaret runs everything here with more efficiency than most military operations. If you need anything, ask her directly. She has full authority to provide whatever makes you comfortable during your stay." The introduction positioned the housekeeper as resource rather than servant, equalizing dynamics that might otherwise feel like charity arrangements. Margaret led them up a curved staircase with banister carved from wood that glowed with the patina of generations of polishing, each step solid beneath their feet, in a way that communicated permanence ordinary construction never achieved. "I've stocked the refrigerator in your sitting room with basics," she explained to Cassidy, in a tone that was warm without being condescending. "But meals are served in the main dining room at 8, 1, and 7 if you prefer company. Mr. Falcone typically eats dinner alone in his study, so you won't feel obligated to socialize if you'd rather maintain privacy." The guest suite was larger than the entire motel room had been, spaces flowing into each other with architectural grace that made clear this wing had been designed for important visitors rather than temporary accommodation. Maisie's bedroom featured a 4-poster bed with curtains that could be drawn to create cave-like privacy, and windows overlooking gardens that stretched toward tree line in the distance. She dropped her art supplies on the desk position to catch natural light, her face reflecting cautious hope that maybe this place offered safety rather than just another temporary stop. Cassidy's room connected through a door that could be locked from either side, giving both privacy and immediate access in emergencies that mothers never stopped anticipating. The furniture was antique without being fragile, pieces chosen for beauty and function rather than display, suggesting someone understood the difference between wealth meant to impress and wealth meant to be lived with. She sat on the edge of the bed, testing its support with suspicion of someone accustomed to mattresses that revealed their springs after minimal use. "Mom, there's a whole bathroom just for us," Maisie called from the adjoining space, her voice echoing slightly off tile and marble that transformed ordinary acoustics into something church-like. "The tub is big enough to swim in, and there's a separate shower with so many different shower heads I can't count them all." The discovery carried wonder that made Cassidy's chest tighten, with awareness of how little her daughter had experienced of comfort most people considered basic rather than luxurious. The sitting room between the bedrooms contained shelves of books that someone had curated with care rather than selecting for appearance, titles suggesting actual reading rather than decorative collection. Cassidy pulled one down at random, finding worn pages that indicated this volume had been handled frequently, margins containing notes in handwriting that didn't match the printed text. Someone in this house valued knowledge enough to argue with authors, to engage with ideas, rather than passively consuming them. Margaret reappeared with towels and toiletries, setting them in the bathroom with practiced efficiency, before turning to Cassidy, with expression that suggested she understood the discomfort of entering spaces not designed for people like them. "The house can feel overwhelming at first," she said quietly, her accent carrying traces of similar working-class origins to Cassidy's own. "I've been here 23 years, since Mr. Falcone's grandfather was still alive. The family has its complications, but Gideon is a good man trying to navigate impossible circumstances inherited from his grandfather's choices." The endorsement surprised Cassidy with its personal warmth, suggesting Margaret saw her employer as something beyond the criminal reputation that preceded him in public consciousness. "How can you work for someone involved in organized crime?" Cassidy asked bluntly, too exhausted for diplomatic deflection. "Doesn't it bother you knowing that the money paying your salary comes from activities that hurt people?" Margaret's expression flickered with something that might have been pain, or perhaps just weariness with questions she'd asked herself repeatedly over 2 decades. Mr. Falcone inherited empire his grandfather built through methods that were brutal even by standards of that era, she explained with careful precision. But Gideon has spent 15 years trying to reform operations, moving resources toward legitimate businesses, refusing involvement in drugs or human trafficking that his grandfather considered acceptable profit centers. He's not innocent, but he's trying to be better than his inheritance demanded. The explanation offered nuance that Cassidy's moral framework struggled to process, gray areas between good and evil that her survival had required she maintain as clear boundaries. "Trying to be better isn't the same as being good," she said, but the statement carried less conviction than she'd intended. Recent events had demonstrated that binary categorizations failed when applied to real people making complex choices in situations that offered no purely moral options. Maisie emerged from her bedroom with sketchpad already open, having begun drawing the view from her window with the focused intensity that characterized her engagement with the world. "The gardens have sculptures hidden in them," she announced, her pencil capturing lines with confidence beyond her years. "I can see 3 from my window, but I think there are more if you walk the paths. Can we explore later, Mom? I want to draw them all." The request was so normal, so wonderfully ordinary in its childish enthusiasm, that Cassidy felt tears threaten for the first time since the police precinct. Her daughter was asking to play, to explore, to engage with beauty rather than merely survive another day of navigation through threatening landscapes. "We'll ask Mr. Falcone," she managed, her voice rougher than intended. "This is his home, and we're guests here because of danger we brought to his attention. We can't just wander wherever we want." Gideon's voice came from the sitting room doorway, his arrival unnoticed during their conversation about gardens and sculptures. "You can wander anywhere on the grounds," he said, his tone making clear this was invitation rather than grudging permission. "The only restricted areas are the security offices in the north wing where business operations are conducted. Everything else is yours to explore. I'll have Marcus assign a security detail that maintains distance but ensures safety." The casual offer of freedom within boundaries surprised Cassidy, who'd expected restrictions that came with protection arrangements, where controlled subjects required constant monitoring. "You trust us not to abuse that access?" she asked, skepticism evident in her tone. "Most people in your position would worry about guests documenting layouts or photographing security measures, gathering intelligence that could be sold or used for planning attacks." Gideon's smile held genuine amusement rather than condescension at her suspicion. "Your daughter saved my life with absolutely no expectation of reward or recognition," he pointed out reasonably. "That demonstrates character I trust more than background checks or supervised access ever could. Besides, Maisie's observational skills already cataloged more security details in her drawing than most professionals would notice in a week of surveillance. If you wanted to betray me, you had opportunity before accepting protection. The logic was sound enough to make Cassidy's arguments evaporate, leaving her with the uncomfortable realization that Gideon's trust might be genuine, rather than calculated manipulation designed to create obligation. "I'll have dinner sent up tonight," Margaret offered, sensing the emotional exhaustion radiating from both mother and daughter. "Tomorrow is soon enough to navigate dining room protocols and meeting the rest of the household staff. Tonight you should rest and adjust to new surroundings without pressure to perform normalcy you're not feeling." Maisie had already returned her attention to sketching, her hand moving across the page with unconscious grace that reminded Gideon painfully of Connor Brennan's precise movements during weapons maintenance. The same focused intensity applied to completely different purpose. "She has real talent," he observed quietly, watching lines emerge that captured not just visual accuracy, but emotional essence of the landscape. "Has she had formal training? Or is this entirely self-taught observation?" "Self-taught," Cassidy admitted with pride that transcended current awkwardness about accepting criminals' protection. "I can't afford art classes, but the library offers free programs on Saturdays where volunteer teachers give basic instruction. Maisie absorbs everything, practices constantly, fills notebooks with drawings of whatever catches her attention. It's her way of making sense of the world when words aren't enough." The explanation resonated with Gideon's own relationship to music, the piano in his study that provided outlet for emotions that criminal enterprises required he suppress in all other contexts. "There's an art studio in the West Wing," he said, the offer emerging before he'd consciously decided to make it. "My grandmother was a painter, and the room still contains her supplies and equipment. Most of it hasn't been touched since she died 8 years ago. Maisie is welcome to use whatever she finds there." Cassidy's expression reflected conflict between pride that prevented accepting charity and recognition that her daughter's talent deserved resources she couldn't provide through her own efforts. "That's generous," she managed finally, the words carrying weight of concession that cost her something to acknowledge. "Maisie would love access to real art supplies. She makes do with dollar store materials that limit what she can create, but she's never complained because she knows there's no money for better." Margaret touched Cassidy's shoulder with gentle understanding before excusing herself to arrange dinner service, leaving the three of them in sitting room that suddenly felt too intimate for the complicated dynamics developing between people thrown together by violence and historical debt. Gideon moved toward the door, recognizing that his presence added pressure when Cassidy needed space to process the day's traumatic upheaval, without audience expecting gracious acceptance. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said, pausing at the threshold with hand on the frame. "Tomorrow, Marcus will brief you on security protocols and emergency procedures, but tonight, just rest. You're safe here, and that's the only thing that matters right now." The statement was simple but sincere, offering reassurance without demanding reciprocal gratitude that would have made acceptance feel like transaction requiring payment. After he left, Cassidy moved to her daughter's side, watching Maisie's hands create beauty from observation, with tools that cost less than the gilded frame surrounding the doorway they'd entered through. "What do you think of Mr. Falcone?" she asked carefully, wanting her daughter's unfiltered assessment before adult context complicated childish instincts that often proved more accurate than sophisticated analysis. Maisie considered the question with the seriousness she applied to all inquiries about her observations, her pencil pausing mid-stroke while she processed. "I think he's sad about my dad," she said finally, the insight cutting through complexity to essential emotional truth. "And I think he's scared that he's not good like my dad was, even though he wants to be. That's why he tries so hard to do the right thing now, because he's worried it's too late to make up for being wrong before." Dawn arrived through windows that faced east, morning light transforming the gardens into watercolor landscape that made Maisie abandon her bed to press her face against the glass with reverence for beauty she'd never experienced from inside safety. Cassidy woke to the sound of her daughter's quiet exclamation, finding Maisie already dressed in yesterday's clothes with sketchpad positioned to catch the sunrise's effect on sculptural forms that emerged from morning mist like ancient sentinels guarding secrets. The breakfast Margaret delivered was excessive by their standards, fresh fruit and pastries that smelled like someone had baked them that morning, rather than purchasing from industrial suppliers who prioritized consistency over quality. Cassidy ate mechanically, her mind churning through practical concerns about lost employment and uncertain timeline for return to normal life that probably no longer existed anyway. Everything they'd built over 8 months of grinding effort had evaporated in hours, Stability revealed as illusion maintained only through constant vigilance that had finally failed. A knock interrupted her spiral into anxiety. Marcus Webb entering at Cassidy's permission with tablet containing security briefing materials, an expression that suggested he took her safety as seriously as any military objective. "Good morning," he said with professional courtesy that acknowledged their discomfort. "I need 30 minutes to review protocols and emergency procedures. Then Maisie can explore the grounds with escort while we discuss longer-term arrangements with Mr. Falcone." The briefing was thorough without being condescending. Marcus explaining security zones and communication systems with efficiency that assumed intelligence rather than treating them like children requiring simplified explanations. Panic buttons were installed in every room, coded signals that would bring immediate response, exit routes mapped with clarity that made memorization straightforward. "The goal is for you to live normally within these boundaries," Marcus emphasized. "Security works best when people don't feel imprisoned by protection measures." Maisie listened with the same focused attention she applied to everything, asking questions that revealed she understood threat assessment better than most adults. What if someone pretends to be delivery person or repair service? She wanted to know, her 7-year-old mind already gaming scenarios where deception might penetrate security. How do you know they're really who they say they are, and not bad people trying to get inside? Marcus smiled with genuine appreciation for her tactical thinking. "All service personnel are vetted 48 hours in advance," he explained patiently. "No one enters the property without confirmation through multiple channels, and staff who interact with visitors are trained to spot behavioral inconsistencies that suggest coercion or deception. You're thinking like someone who understands security isn't just physical barriers, but psychological assessment of human behavior." The praise made Maisie glow with pride, validation from professional who recognized her observational gifts as valuable rather than strange. Cassidy watched the interaction with mixture of maternal pleasure and unease about her daughter developing skills that shouldn't be necessary for 7-year-old navigating ordinary childhood. But ordinary had never described their lives, and pretending otherwise served no protective purpose when reality demanded different capabilities. After Marcus finished the briefing, a young woman named Sophia appeared to escort Maisie on garden exploration, her friendly demeanor masking the professional training evident in the way she moved and scanned surroundings constantly. "I'll stay within sight of the house," she promised Cassidy, understanding maternal anxiety about letting child out of immediate reach after yesterday's trauma. "Maisie can draw whatever catches her interest while I make sure she stays safe. The grounds are secure, but vigilance is automatic habit for all of us." Cassidy watched from the window as Maisie practically skipped across the lawn toward the first sculpture, her small figure seeming impossibly vulnerable against the estate's vast spaces. Sophia maintained position that allowed freedom while ensuring protection, finding balance between security and autonomy that suggested she'd done this before. The young guard pulled out her own phone, appearing to scroll casually while actually monitoring approaches and exits with practiced efficiency. Gideon found Cassidy still watching from the window when he arrived for the discussion Marcus had mentioned, his presence announced by quiet knock that gave her time to compose herself before granting entrance. "She's resilient," he observed, following Cassidy's gaze to where Maisie had settled cross-legged before a bronze figure, her hands already moving across paper. "That's genetic inheritance from Connor, who processed trauma through action rather than paralysis. He used to disassemble and reassemble his rifle after difficult missions, finding peace in mechanical precision." The detail about Connor surprised Cassidy with its specificity, intimate knowledge of habits that revealed Gideon had known her late husband beyond the single incident that bound their fates. "You served together for a while before the ambush," she realized aloud, pieces falling into place about how he could recognize Connor's traits in their daughter. "You weren't just soldiers in the same operation. You were actually friends who knew each other well enough to share personal habits." Gideon nodded, something painful flickering across his expression, before professional control reasserted itself. "Connor and I went through advanced training together, deployed twice before the operation that killed him," he confirmed quietly. "He talked about you constantly, showed everyone pictures of the positive pregnancy test, made plans for future he never got to experience. When he died protecting me, I inherited not just survival guilt, but knowledge of exactly what he lost, and what you both lost, because of my failure to read the situation correctly." The admission carried weight of 15 years carrying another man's unlived future, survivor's burden compounded by intimate knowledge of what had been stolen from people he'd cared about. "You could have found us," Cassidy said, the accusation emerging without heat, but with genuine confusion about choices not made. You knew Connor had pregnant girlfriend. You knew my name from his constant talking. Why didn't you ever reach out to check if we survived without him? If we needed help? Gideon's face reflected shame that had clearly haunted him for years without resolution. I tried once, 3 years after Connor died, he admitted, his voice carrying self-recrimination. But by then, I'd inherited my grandfather's organization and recognized that bringing people I cared about into my world endangered them more than helping. I told myself you were better off without connection to someone whose business interests attracted violence. That rationalization felt noble at the time, but watching you struggle while I had resources to help means I chose cowardice disguised as protection. The honesty disarmed Cassidy's defensive anger, making her confront complexity that simple resentment couldn't address adequately. So you protected us by abandoning us, she said slowly, processing implications of choices that seemed reasonable from one angle and devastating from another. Let us live in poverty, rather than risk association with criminal enterprise that might have provided security alongside danger. I can't decide if that was selfless or selfish, Gideon. Maybe it was both. I tell myself it was both, Gideon acknowledged, accepting her assessment without attempting to justify his decisions with arguments that would sound like excuses. I was young and arrogant, convinced I could reform the organization from within, while keeping everyone I cared about safely distant from consequences. But distance doesn't equal safety when poverty creates different threats than violence. I should have found middle ground, ways to help without full disclosure of our connection. The conversation stretched between them with uncomfortable honesty, both people recognizing they were navigating territory that required vulnerability. Neither had practice offering. Marcus entered with files that apparently contained the information they needed for discussing longer-term arrangements, his timing suggesting he'd been monitoring conversation and chose this moment to redirect toward practical concerns. We've identified 3 members of Marchetti's bomb team, he reported, setting photographs on the table between Gideon and Cassidy. 2 are professionals he brought in from outside his normal organization, which confirms this operation had significant planning and resources behind it. Cassidy studied the faces with intensity that searched for recognition, despite knowing she'd never seen these men before. Will identifying them help? She asked, trying to understand criminal justice processes that operated differently when organized crime was involved. Can police arrest them based on Maisie's drawings and witness testimony? The question carried hope that maybe this situation could be resolved through legitimate legal channels that didn't require remaining indefinitely under protection of man, whose business she fundamentally opposed. Marcus and Gideon exchanged glances that communicated volumes about the gap between legal theory and practical reality. The evidence is solid enough for arrest warrants, Marcus explained carefully, but actually locating and apprehending them is different matter. Marchetti will have moved them to safe houses or out of jurisdiction entirely, and even if caught, their testimony would be purchased through plea deals that don't necessarily identify whoever ordered the hit. So we're stuck here indefinitely while you conduct private investigation that operates outside legal constraints, Cassidy said flatly, her tone making clear she understood exactly what that meant. You're going to handle this the way you handle business disputes, through intimidation and violence that forces Marchetti to back down or eliminates him as threat entirely. And we're supposed to accept protection, bought with methods we find morally reprehensible. Gideon didn't flinch from her assessment's accuracy. Yes, he said simply, refusing to soften reality with euphemisms that would insult her intelligence. The legal system moves too slowly when dealing with organized crime that has resources to exploit every procedural protection. If I wait for proper channels to resolve this, Marchetti will have multiple opportunities to make attempts on your lives or mine. I'm offering you safety through methods you don't approve of, and you have every right to refuse if moral purity matters more than survival. The stark framing of choices made Cassidy want to argue, to find third option that preserved both safety and principles. But exhaustion and pragmatism overrode idealism, that luxury of security allowed people to maintain. I hate this, she said quietly. The admission carrying defeat that came from recognizing her daughter's life couldn't be wagered on philosophical principles. I hate that the world works this way, that doing the right thing means accepting help from people who do wrong things, that there's no pure solution that lets me protect Maisie without compromising everything I've tried to teach her about right and wrong. Connor hated it too, Gideon said gently, his voice carrying understanding of the moral compromise she was making. He used to argue with me during deployment about whether ends ever justified means, whether protecting innocent people gave us license to employ methods we'd condemn in enemies. He never resolved that tension, just chose to act according to principles despite knowing the world didn't reward that kind of integrity. You're making the same choice he made, prioritizing protection over purity because love demands pragmatism. 3 weeks into their stay at the estate, Cassidy woke to find Maisie's bed empty, and panic flooded her system with the kind of terror that erased rational thought within seconds. She ran through connecting rooms calling her daughter's name with increasing desperation, her bare feet slapping against hardwood floors that suddenly felt like enemy territory. The security button Marcus had installed was in her hand before conscious decision registered, her thumb hovering over the panic activation that would bring armed response. "Mom, I'm in the art studio." Maisie's voice floated up from somewhere below, carrying the oblivious calm of a child who didn't understand her absence would terrify a mother still processing recent trauma. Cassidy found her daughter in the West Wing surrounded by her grandmother's painting supplies, working on a canvas that showed the gardens at sunrise, with technique that had improved dramatically. Sophia sat nearby with coffee and tablet, her presence confirming that Maisie hadn't been unsupervised despite the early hour. "You need to tell me when you leave the suite," Cassidy said, her voice shaking with residual fear that made the reprimand harsher than she'd intended. "I woke up and you were gone, and all I could think was that someone had taken you while I slept." The admission revealed vulnerability she typically guarded, exposing the constant vigilance that exhausted her, even in spaces supposedly secured against external threats. Maisie's face crumpled with immediate remorse, her brush freezing mid-stroke as she recognized the distress her independence had caused. "I'm sorry," she said in a small voice that carried genuine contrition. "I woke up early and wanted to paint the light through the trees, and Sophia was already in the hallway, so I asked her to bring me here. I didn't think about you being scared because nothing bad was happening." The logic was sound from a child's perspective, but Cassidy needed her daughter to understand that safety required communication, even when danger wasn't immediately apparent. "Bad things happen suddenly," she explained, pulling Maisie into a hug that communicated love alongside the correction. "That's why we have rules about staying together and telling each other where we're going. The security here is good, but it only works if everyone follows protocols designed to prevent surprises." Sophia intervened gently, recognizing that mother and daughter needed to navigate this adjustment without audience. "I should have insisted Maisie wake you before leaving the suite," she acknowledged, taking responsibility that diffused some of Cassidy's residual anger. "The fault was mine for assuming implied permission rather than requiring explicit consent. It won't happen again." The professional acceptance of error demonstrated the kind of accountability that made trust possible. Later that morning, Marcus appeared with news that transformed the threat from abstract to immediate, his expression carrying the particular tension that preceded delivering information no one wanted to hear. "Marchetti made a move," he said without preamble, setting his tablet on the dining table where Cassidy and Gideon were reviewing arrangements for her to maintain some form of income despite isolation. He filed suit claiming Maisie's testimony was coerced and demanding access to question her directly about what she witnessed. The legal filing is smokescreen, but it confirms he's identified her as the witness and is escalating pressure. Gideon's jaw tightened with barely controlled fury at the audacity of using legal system as weapon against a child who'd simply tried to prevent murder. "He's forcing our hand," he said quietly, his tone carrying implications that Cassidy was learning to read as precursors to decisions made outside conventional channels. By making Maisie's identity public record through the filing, he's signaling that she's no longer protected by anonymity. He wants us to know that he knows exactly who interfered with his operation. Cassidy felt ice settle in her stomach as she processed what Marcus and Gideon were communicating through careful language designed to avoid explicit statements of criminal intent. "You're going to go after him directly," she said, the statement emerging as flat observation, rather than question. "You're going to eliminate the threat by eliminating Marchetti himself, and you're telling me this because there's risk involved that might extend to us if the operation goes wrong. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what measures are being taken to ensure your safety," Gideon corrected gently, though he didn't deny her assessment of his intentions. "Marchetti has made it clear he won't stop pursuing revenge, which means defensive posture isn't sufficient strategy. But the operation involves risks beyond simple confrontation, and I need you to understand that things might get worse before they get better." Marcus pulled up additional files showing Marchetti's organizational structure, highlighting the network of connections that made him dangerous beyond his personal capabilities. "He's formed alliance with the Constantine family out of Brighton Beach," Marcus explained, his finger tracing relationships that created spiderweb of criminal enterprise. They're providing the military-grade explosives and technical expertise he lacked, which means taking him down requires disrupting the entire supply chain, rather than just removing one individual. The complexity of what they were describing made Cassidy realize this wasn't simple elimination, but rather strategic dismantling of criminal network that required coordination across multiple fronts. "How long will this take?" she asked, trying to understand timeline for resolution that would allow them to resume some version of normal life. "Weeks? Months? Are we supposed to stay hidden here indefinitely while you wage war against people who won't stop until everyone involved is dead?" Gideon's expression reflected the weight of responsibility he carried for drawing them into conflict that predated their involvement by years. "The operation is already in motion," he said carefully, choosing words that conveyed truth without providing details that could implicate her if authorities eventually questioned her. "Within 2 weeks, Marchetti's organization will be sufficiently disrupted that continuing pursuit of revenge becomes more costly than accepting the loss. He'll have bigger problems than a 7-year-old witness to a failed bombing." The clinical description of violence wrapped in euphemistic language made Cassidy want to demand specifics that would force Gideon to acknowledge exactly what methods he was employing. But part of her recognized that ignorance provided protection, that knowing details made her complicit in ways that not knowing didn't. "I don't want to know more," she said finally. The admission carrying defeat that came from recognizing her moral principles had already been compromised by accepting shelter. "Just promise me that whatever you do won't create more orphans like Maisie, more women left to raise children alone because men decided their pride mattered more than families." The request surprised Gideon with its specific targeting of collateral damage rather than questioning the operation's fundamental legitimacy. "I can't promise no one will be hurt," he said honestly, refusing to offer false comfort that would insult her intelligence. "But I can promise that our approach prioritizes disruption over destruction, targeting infrastructure and resources, rather than individuals wherever possible. The goal is to make Marchetti's organization collapse under strategic pressure, rather than piling up bodies that create new cycles of revenge." Maisie appeared in the doorway with Sophia trailing behind, her arrival interrupting conversation that had grown too heavy for continuation in her presence. "Can we visit the horses today?" she asked, with the cheerful obliviousness of childhood that could compartmentalize danger when immediate surroundings felt safe. "Sophia said there are stables on the property with horses that need exercising, and I've never touched a horse before except in pictures." The request was so wonderfully normal that Cassidy felt tears threaten for the second time since arriving at the estate, her daughter's resilience both blessing and source of maternal guilt about circumstances that required such adaptation. "That sounds nice," she managed, her voice only slightly rough with suppressed emotion. "Maybe Mr. Falcone would show us the stables himself if he has time this afternoon." The suggestion was partly about giving Maisie positive experience, and partly about needing to see Gideon interact with her daughter in context removed from discussions of violence and strategy. Gideon accepted the implicit invitation with something approaching relief, recognizing that Cassidy was offering opportunity for them to engage as people rather than protector and protected. "The stables are my favorite part of the property," he admitted, his tone shifting to something warmer than the controlled professionalism he typically maintained. "My grandmother taught me to ride when I was younger than Maisie, and I've maintained the tradition even though business obligations leave less time than the horses deserve. They'd probably appreciate attention from someone who sees them as magnificent creatures, rather than expensive assets requiring maintenance." The afternoon at the stables revealed dimension of Gideon that Cassidy hadn't witnessed in their previous interactions, patience and gentleness with animals that translated to unexpected skill at teaching a nervous 7-year-old how to approach creatures that outweighed her by 10 times. He showed Maisie how to read the horse's body language, explaining that communication happened through posture and breath rather than words. "They're prey animals," he told her softly, "which means they're always watching for threats the way you watch people in situations. You have that in common, the instinct to notice what others miss." Maisie stroked the velvet nose of a gray mare with reverence, her artist's hands gentle despite their eagerness to touch and explore. "She's beautiful," she breathed, her gray-green eyes wide with wonder that made her look younger than her 7 years. "Can I draw her later? I want to remember exactly how her mane falls and the way her eyes look like they understand things." The request made Gideon smile with genuine warmth, recognizing artistic impulse he'd observed in his grandmother decades ago. "You can draw her any time," he promised, then surprised them both by adding, And when you're older, if you're still interested, I'll teach you to ride properly. Your father was an excellent horseman despite growing up in the city, picked it up during military training and took to it like he'd been born in a saddle. He used to say that horses taught him more about reading situations than any tactical instruction ever did. The personal detail about Connor created bridge between past and present, connecting Maisie to a father she'd never known through shared appreciation for creatures that communicated beyond language. Cassidy watched her daughter's face transform with pride at this new piece of her father's story, collecting fragments of identity from a man who existed primarily through others' memories. "Did he have a favorite horse?" Maisie asked Gideon, hungry for any detail that made Connor real, rather than abstract concept of heroic sacrifice. "He did," Gideon confirmed, moving to a stall that housed a bay gelding with intelligent eyes and calm demeanor. "This is Ranger's grandson, actually descended from the horse Connor rode during training exercises. I acquired him years after Connor died. When I learned the breeding line was being sold off, seemed important to maintain that connection, even if Connor never knew this particular animal." The admission revealed sentimentality that didn't fit with criminal boss reputation, suggesting grief had shaped choices in ways that went beyond guilt into genuine love. 4 weeks after the bombing attempt, Marcus delivered news that signaled shift from defensive waiting to strategic resolution, his expression carrying satisfaction that came from pieces falling into place after careful planning. "Marchetti's supply chain is collapsing," he reported to Gideon during meeting that Cassidy had been invited to attend. The Constantine family withdrew support after their Brighton Beach operations experienced unexpected federal attention, and Marchetti's financial resources are being systematically frozen through legal challenges to his front companies. He's effectively isolated with no allies willing to risk association. The description of coordinated assault across multiple fronts impressed Cassidy despite her discomfort with the methods employed, recognizing strategic sophistication that went beyond simple violence. "How did you manage federal involvement without them tracing it back to you?" she asked, genuinely curious about mechanisms that allowed criminal organization to weaponize legal system. "I thought agencies like the FBI didn't cooperate with people in your business, that they'd arrest you before helping you eliminate competition." Gideon's smile held no humor, just acknowledgement of reality's complexity that exceeded simplistic narratives about law enforcement. "The FBI doesn't cooperate with me," he clarified, "but they have their own interest in disrupting the Constantine family's weapons trafficking network. Anonymous tips providing detailed documentation of their operations allowed federal agents to justify raids they'd been planning anyway. That those raids happened to serve my interests is confluence rather than conspiracy." Marcus added technical details about financial pressure being applied through legitimate business channels, lawsuits and regulatory challenges that drained Marchetti's resources without requiring any action that could be traced to Gideon's organization. "The beauty of operating in gray areas is that legal tools become available when properly deployed," he explained to Cassidy, who was learning that crime and business existed on spectrum rather than as discrete categories. "Most of what we've done to undermine Marchetti would be taught in business school as aggressive but legitimate competitive strategy. Except the part where you're doing it to prevent him from murdering a child who witnessed his failed assassination attempt," Cassidy said dryly, her tone making clear she wasn't buying the sanitized version that pretended this was ordinary corporate maneuvering. "Let's not pretend that market competition typically involves protecting witnesses to attempted bombings orchestrated by people who think explosives under cars is reasonable dispute resolution." The blunt assessment made Marcus laugh with genuine appreciation for her refusal to accept euphemistic framing, while Gideon nodded acknowledgement that she was right to call out the distinction. "Fair point," he conceded without defensiveness. "The methods might overlap with legitimate business, but the context makes it categorically different. I'm using those tools to neutralize someone who threatened you and Maisie, which is personal rather than professional no matter how I frame the approach." Later that week, Detective Reeves appeared at the estate with news that carried its own implications about how Cassidy's presence at the property was being monitored by authorities. "We've arrested 2 of the bombers," she informed them during meeting in Gideon's study, her professional demeanor not quite masking satisfaction at closing major case. "They're cooperating in exchange for reduced sentences, provided testimony that directly implicates Marchetti in conspiracy to commit murder. Combined with forensic evidence and Maisie's drawings, we have solid case that will put him away for minimum 20 years. The legal resolution should have felt like victory, but Cassidy recognized from Gideon's expression that official justice was secondary to whatever private resolution he'd already implemented. "That's excellent news," he said with appropriate enthusiasm that felt slightly performative. Maisie will be relieved to know the men who planted the bombs are in custody and facing consequences for their actions. When do you anticipate trial date? Assuming Marchetti doesn't take a plea deal. Reeves consulted her notes with the efficient movements of someone who'd come prepared for this conversation. Marchetti's lawyer is already floating plea negotiations, she admitted, which typically indicates defendant knows the evidence is overwhelming. My guess is he'll take deal that avoids trial in exchange for 25-year sentence, which effectively ends his criminal career, given that he'll be 70 when released. The practical outcome satisfied legal system's requirements, even if it lacked dramatic closure that popular media suggested criminal cases received. Cassidy felt complicated mix of relief and dissatisfaction, with resolution that put bad man in prison, but couldn't undo the terror or upheaval his actions had caused. "So we can go home?" she asked, the question emerging with less enthusiasm than she'd expected. 3 weeks at the estate had created routines that felt sustainable in ways their previous existence never had, security that allowed Maisie to be child rather than constantly vigilant observer of threats. "We can return to the city and resume normal life now that he's in custody." Gideon and Marcus exchanged glances that communicated something Cassidy couldn't quite read, hesitation that suggested the answer wasn't as straightforward as legal resolution implied. "You can leave any time you want," Gideon said carefully, his tone making clear he wasn't imposing obligation beyond what Cassidy chose to accept. "But I'd like to ask you to stay while we arrange something that matters to both of us, something that concerns Connor's legacy and the recognition he deserved but never received." The cryptic statement intrigued Cassidy. Despite her wariness about getting further entangled in Gideon's world, curiosity overriding caution about what kind of arrangement would require her continued presence. "What are you talking about?" she asked directly, too tired of evasions and careful language to tolerate more mystery. "What could you possibly arrange that concerns Connor after 15 years? He's dead and buried, and the military made clear they considered his service classified to the point of erasing his heroism from official record." Gideon pulled out file folder that Marcus must have prepared in advance, documents that suggested extensive research and coordination with sources Cassidy couldn't imagine accessing. "I've spent the last month working with contacts who owe me favors to pressure the Department of Defense into reviewing Connor's classified operation," he explained, sliding papers across his desk that showed official letterhead and authorization signatures. "They're convening special ceremony to posthumously award him the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the ambush. Full military honors with acknowledgement of what his sacrifice prevented." The words took several seconds to penetrate Cassidy's understanding, the concept so far beyond anything she'd imagined that her mind initially rejected it as impossible. "They're going to officially recognize Connor's heroism," she managed finally, her voice breaking on the last word as 15 years of fighting bureaucratic indifference threatened to overwhelm her composure. "They're going to admit that he died protecting people, and that his death meant something beyond classified footnote in files no one would ever read." "The ceremony is scheduled for 3 weeks from today at the National Cemetery," Marcus added, providing practical details that grounded abstract promise in concrete reality. "You and Maisie will be presented with the medal and citation that describes exactly what Connor did, why it mattered, and how many lives he saved through his actions. It won't bring him back, but it ensures his daughter knows her father was hero whose sacrifice is honored by the country he served." Maisie had been drawing in the corner of the study during the adult conversation, her presence accepted without question. As Gideon's household had learned, she processed the world through observation and artistic documentation. But now she looked up from her sketchpad with understanding that 7 years of hearing whispered comments about her father had made her desperate for different narrative. "People will know my dad was brave?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying hope that hurt Cassidy's heart. "They won't think he abandoned us anymore?" Cassidy gathered her daughter close, unable to speak through tears that she'd held back for weeks of stress and fear and exhausted vigilance. Gideon left his desk to crouch beside them both, his own eyes suspiciously bright with emotion he typically guarded against revealing. "Your father was one of the bravest men I ever knew," he told Maisie with absolute conviction. "And everyone who attends that ceremony will know it too. No more whispers, no more speculation, just truth about what he did and why it mattered." The weeks leading to the ceremony passed with preparation that felt both too slow and too fast, time stretching and compressing as they navigated logistics of presenting Maisie and Cassidy to military officials, who would officiate over recognition, 15 years delayed. Margaret coordinated appropriate clothing, ensuring they'd present well without feeling costumed. while Sophia worked with Maisie on understanding what the ceremony meant without overwhelming her with expectations. "You don't have to perform grief," Sophia explained gently during one of their conversations. "You're allowed to feel whatever you feel about father you never met, pride or curiosity, or even confusion. There's no wrong response to complicated situation." Gideon maintained respectful distance during preparations, while remaining available for questions about protocol and expectations, his presence steady without being intrusive. He spent evenings playing piano in his study with the door open, music floating through the house in ways that communicated emotion he couldn't voice directly. Cassidy found herself drawn to the doorway one night, watching his hands move across keys with the same focused intensity Maisie applied to drawing. "Connor loved music," she said quietly, not wanting to interrupt, but needing to share the connection. "He used to say that Chopin understood melancholy better than words ever could." The observation made Gideon's hands still mid-phrase, his shoulders tensing with recognition that Cassidy had identified exactly what he was playing. "He told me the same thing," he said softly, turning on the bench to face her. After difficult missions, he'd find recordings and sit with headphones, processing things he couldn't talk about through someone else's composition. "I learned to play because it felt like maintaining connection after he died, interpreting grief through music the way he taught me." The shared memory created intimacy that transcended the complicated circumstances of their acquaintance. Two people united by love for man who'd shaped both their lives through his presence and absence. "I'm glad you survived," Cassidy said suddenly, the admission surprising them both with its unvarnished honesty. "Not because I approve of what you do, or because I think Connor would want me here, but because his sacrifice meant something. He chose to save you, which means he saw something worth preserving even if you can't see it yourself sometimes." The ceremony took place on October morning, when autumn had stripped leaves from trees and left the cemetery landscape stark with the kind of beauty that acknowledged loss without romanticizing it. Military honor guards stood at attention, while Officer read citation describing Connor's actions with specificity that made them real rather than abstract heroism. Maisie held her mother's hand throughout the formal presentation, her gray-green eyes solemn with understanding that this moment redefined her father's legacy. When the flag was presented to Cassidy with words thanking her for Connor's service and sacrifice, something broke inside her that had been holding rigid against grief for 15 years. She accepted the precisely folded triangle with shaking hands, feeling the weight of fabric and ceremony, and all the years she'd fought alone. Maisie leaned against her side with 7-year-old's instinct for providing physical comfort when words failed, her small body anchoring Cassidy to present moment. Gideon stood apart from the family grouping with Marcus and other members of his security team, who'd come to honor Connor's memory despite never having known him personally. His expression reflected complicated emotions that public setting required he contain, survivor's guilt mixed with pride that he'd finally managed some form of restitution. When Cassidy's eyes found his across the assembled crowd, something passed between them that transcended gratitude or obligation, recognition of connection forged through shared loss. The reception following the ceremony brought together Connor's former military colleagues with Cassidy's small circle of friends who'd maintained contact through years of struggle. Maisie moved through the gathering with her sketch pad, drawing people as they talked about her father, capturing expressions and gestures that would help her construct understanding. One retired colonel spent 20 minutes describing Connor's sense of humor, the way he'd diffused tension through perfectly timed observations that made everyone laugh. The colonel watched Maisie work with appreciation for talent that went beyond technical skill, into realm of genuine artistic vision that captured truth beneath surface appearances. "Your daughter is remarkable," he told Cassidy, as Maisie sketched a veteran describing combat mission where Connor's quick thinking had prevented casualties. "She has Connor's gift for reading people, seeing what others miss because they're not paying close enough attention to the world around them." The observation connected Maisie's artistic abilities to her father's tactical assessment in ways that made Cassidy realize the trait she'd worried about was actually inherited strength. "She saved someone's life with those observational skills," Cassidy said quietly, glancing toward where Gideon stood talking with Marcus about arrangements. Drew something she saw without understanding its significance, then had the courage to act when she recognized danger threatening someone she'd never met before. The colonel followed her gaze, his expression shifting to understanding as he recognized Gideon, despite civilian clothes and absent military bearing that had once defined him as soldier. "Connor saved Falcone's life," he said, not as question, but a statement connecting dots that explained protective arrangement between unlikely allies. And now Falcone's been protecting Connor's family in return. That's the kind of debt men like them take seriously. Obligation that transcends civilian comfort. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, guests began departing with condolences and expressions of gratitude that Connor's service was finally receiving public recognition it deserved. Cassidy found herself alone with Gideon near the grave marker that bore Connor's name, and dates that bracketed life cut short by choice to value others. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for expressing what this ceremony meant, but the only ones available to her emotional vocabulary. Gideon studied Connor's marker with expression that revealed how heavily this debt had weighed on him for 15 years of carrying survivor's guilt without resolution. "I told you when we met that keeping you safe was the only thing I wanted in return for your daughter's courage," he said quietly. "But the truth is, I need to protect you, need to honor Connor by ensuring his family has the security he would have provided if survived." The distinction mattered in ways that shifted Cassidy's understanding of their arrangement from temporary protection to something more permanent and complicated than she'd anticipated. "What are you saying?" she asked carefully, needing clarity about intentions before allowing herself to interpret emotional undercurrents that might be wishful projection. "Are you offering continued protection out of obligation? Or is there something else you're not saying directly because you're afraid of how I'll respond?" Gideon turned to face her fully, abandoning the careful distance he'd maintained throughout their acquaintance in favor of honesty that required vulnerability he typically avoided showing anyone. "I'm saying that having you and Maisie at the estate these past weeks has reminded me what it feels like to care about people beyond professional associations. I'm saying that I've spent 20 years telling myself that isolation protected people I cared about, but maybe what it actually did was punish everyone." The confession hung between them with weight of possibility that terrified and tempted Cassidy simultaneously, offering path forward that required accepting complications she'd spent lifetime avoiding for good reasons. "I can't be part of your criminal organization," she said firmly, establishing boundary that wasn't negotiable regardless of developing feelings that complicated her moral framework. "I can't pretend that how you earn living is acceptable just because you've been kind to my daughter and honored my husband's memory faithfully." Gideon accepted her terms without attempting to negotiate around them, or minimize the significance of what she was demanding from him as condition of relationship. "I'm not asking you to approve of my business," he countered reasonably, his voice steady, despite the stakes involved in this conversation. "I'm asking if you'd consider building life with someone who's trying to transition away from criminal enterprise toward legitimate operations, someone who recognizes staying in this world means dying." The promise of change wasn't guarantee of transformation, but it represented willingness to try that Cassidy recognized as more than most people in his position would offer. "I need time," she said finally, unwilling to make decision of this magnitude in cemetery, surrounded by reminders of how quickly life could be stolen. "I need to see if words translate into actions. If your commitment to legitimate business survives beyond initial enthusiasm that fades when difficulties mount." Gideon accepted her conditions with nod that communicated respect for her caution, understanding that trust required demonstration rather than declaration of good intentions without proof. "Take whatever time you need," he said simply, his tone making clear this wasn't negotiation with deadline, but genuine offer of patience. "The estate is yours for as long as you want it, whether that's weeks or months or years. I'm not going anywhere." 6 months later, spring had transformed the estate's gardens into riot of color that made Maisie's artistic documentation feel inadequate to capture beauty that changed daily. She'd filled 3 more sketchbooks with drawings that documented life at the property, visual narrative that showed small family forming from pieces that didn't initially seem compatible. Cassidy had returned to nursing work at private clinic that Gideon's legitimate business interests funded, using skills she'd maintained through years of sporadic employment successfully. Gideon's transition away from criminal operations was progressing with the kind of measured strategy that characterized his approach to complex problems, requiring careful navigation of competing interests. Marcus had become an unexpected ally in this transformation, his security expertise translating effectively into corporate consulting that protected legitimate businesses from cyber threats and physical vulnerabilities. The household staff who'd watched Gideon's grandfather build empire through brutality saw him dismantling that legacy with equal determination, replacing fear-based control with cooperative relationships. One evening in late April, Cassidy found Gideon in the library where he'd been reviewing financial projections that documented declining revenue from divested criminal operations. "You're losing money," she observed, reading over his shoulder with nursing degree that somehow included enough business literacy to interpret basic accounting principles. "The legal enterprises aren't yet generating enough to offset what you're walking away from willingly. How long can you sustain this transition before financial pressure forces compromise?" Gideon answered honestly, showing her detailed analysis that Marcus had prepared, modeling various scenarios and their outcomes over extended timeline with multiple variables considered. 5 years, he said, his finger tracing projections on the screen. "That's the window where I need to prove legitimate business can sustain operations at level that maintains security and covers obligations to people who depend on me. After that, the momentum shifts, and legal revenue should exceed what criminal operations generated under different market conditions." The commitment impressed Cassidy despite her ongoing ambivalence about loving someone whose past couldn't be erased, regardless of present intentions or future actions taken in good faith. 5 years is a long time to operate on declining margins while resisting temptation to make quick money through methods you know work efficiently, she said carefully. "What happens if emergency requires resources you don't have because you've committed to walking away from criminal revenue streams that provided financial security previously?" Gideon considered the question with seriousness it deserved, refusing to offer false assurances that would insult her intelligence or minimize legitimate concerns she was raising about sustainability. "I've built contingency funds that should cover emergencies short of catastrophic loss," he said finally, his tone measured and thoughtful. "But you're right that there's risk involved in transformation of this scale. All I can promise is that I'll exhaust every legal option before considering anything questionable." The transparency was more than Cassidy had expected, acknowledgement of human fallibility rather than claiming perfection he couldn't possibly maintain under pressure of real-world complications. "That's all I can ask," she admitted, moving closer to where he sat surrounded by financial documents that represented attempted redemption through spreadsheets and projections. "I can't demand you be perfect, just that you're honest about struggles and setbacks when they inevitably occur during this difficult transition period." Maisie interrupted their conversation with excited announcement that the gray mare had foaled overnight, creating new family addition that demanded immediate attention and artistic documentation of the event. The three of them walked to the stables together through gardens that Cassidy had helped redesign, her practical input about maintenance requirements tempering Gideon's aesthetic ambitions. The foal was perfect miniature of its mother, all impossibly long legs and curious eyes that tracked their approach with interest rather than fear. "Can we name her Hope?" Maisie asked, her hand gentle on the foal's neck as she made contact with newborn creature experiencing the world for first time. "Because she was born in spring when everything starts new, and because sometimes you have to believe good things can happen even when everything seems hard." The wisdom was profound from 7-year-old perspective, childish optimism that contained truth. Adults struggled to maintain through experience that taught caution and suspicion of easy answers. Gideon and Cassidy exchanged glances over their daughter's head, his expression asking silent question about future that required answer. She'd been avoiding for months out of reasonable fear. "Hope is a perfect name," Cassidy said softly, her hand finding Gideon's with touch that answered more than the immediate question about naming horses. "It reminds us that new beginnings are possible even when past contains things we wish we could change but cannot undo, no matter how much we desire different history." The wedding happened 6 months later, in the same gardens where Maisie had first explored with Sophia's protection. Intimate ceremony, attended by household staff, who'd become family through shared experiences. Maisie served as both flower girl and official artist, documenting the day through drawings that captured joy alongside complexity of blending family from unconventional pieces. Her latest sketchbook would eventually include this wedding among the collection that started with street scene showing men planting bombs, visual narrative of transformation through courage. As Cassidy and Gideon exchanged vows that acknowledged their unconventional path while promising commitment to futures neither had imagined possible initially, Maisie reflected on lessons learned through observation. Her father had saved a life through sacrifice. That man had protected her family in return, and somehow those connected acts of courage had created possibility for healing. She understood that happy endings weren't guaranteed, that Gideon's transformation would require sustained effort, and that her mother's acceptance represented faith rather than certainty about outcomes. But standing in gardens that had witnessed her growth from frightened witness to confident child surrounded by people who'd chosen to become family through deliberate action, Maisie believed hope was reasonable. The sketchbook in her hands contained visual record of their journey, from terror on Madison Avenue to celebration of love and family in these beautiful gardens. She added final drawing to the collection, capturing her mother and Gideon exchanging rings, while Sophia smiled nearby, and Marcus stood watch as always, protecting the family they'd all built together. Thank you all for following this story from that terrifying moment on Madison Avenue to the celebration of love and family that emerged from tragedy and courage. If you enjoyed watching how redemption and second chances transformed lives, write in the comments where you're watching from and what moment resonated most deeply. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so we can continue bringing you stories that explore the complicated beauty of human connection and transformation. Your support means everything.